Hi, everybody. Welcome to Talk Show with Erin. I'm so excited to be with you, with someone I deeply, deeply admire. Welcome, best-selling author, screenwriter, mother, Cheryl Strayed. Thank you for being here.
Hello, it's fabulous to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm so grateful to be with you and to have you on the show and the podcast. There are so many, when I prepared for this call, there were so many different questions I wanted to start with, but I'll first begin with the first time I was in your energy was this past March at South by Southwest, and you were there with Hulu presenting your show, Tiny
Yay.
Beautiful Things. So can you tell us a little bit about that process?
Yes, that's right. I went with our fabulous showrunner, Liz Tigelaar, to talk about the adaptation of my book, Tiny Beautiful Things for Hulu. I was a big part of it. I was an executive producer on the show, or am an executive producer on the show. And I was also a writer on the show. And sadly, it's for that reason I'm a member of the Writers Guild of America. So even though, Erin, I want to talk to you all about the show because there are so many interesting, amazing things to say about it. And it was such an educational, fun experience. And obviously, lots of brilliant people contributed to making the show what it is. But because we're on strike, and I, as a member of the union, am on strike, where I'm going to refrain from, like doing publicity for the show on the podcast. But I really am excited to talk to you about my other work. And of course, I can talk to you about Tiny Beautiful Things, the book. But yeah, that's when we were in the same room. That was, it feels like it was about 2 or 3 months ago, right? It feels like a long time ago, back when I was able to go on the road and publicize the show.
Yeah, it does. It does seem like it was a long time ago, and I'm so sorry that's happening. And we're definitely going to talk about other creative endeavors that you're focusing on. So the 10th anniversary of the book, Tiny Beautiful Things, came out. What was your role in? Did you have to update it or add a new forward?
Yeah. So here's what happened is when I knew the show was, coming along the pipeline, I was like, wait a minute, it is coming out right about the same time that it's just going to have passed its 10th anniversary. And of course, both Wild and Tiny Beautiful Things last year had their 10th anniversary. It's kind of strange to have published two books within a 4 month span, but that's what happened. When Wild was published in March of 2012, it was followed very quickly by Tiny Beautiful Things, which was published in July of 2012. My Dear Sugar book was just kind of this little book that my publisher thought, oh, we'll just sneak this in there behind Wild, and I can tell you more about that if you're curious about it. But since we're talking about the 10th anniversary edition, I'll tell you how that happened. Is when I knew that the show was coming out, I got in touch with my publisher, and one of the interesting things about Tiny Beautiful Things to me is that it's this book that just over the 10 years that it was published just kept selling. It was like the little engine that could. It is a book that people read and then go buy a copy of it for their friend, and very often for their friend or their partner or their sister or brother or mother or father, at a time when that person is at a crossroads or has just achieved something like a graduation or has just had something hard happen to them, a breakup or the loss of a loved one. So many people over this past decade plus have said, okay, I bought the book and then I gave it to my friend whose husband left her and it helped her. So the book has really over its life been the kind of a book that people pass from hand to hand. And so I approached my publisher and said, listen, I feel like we should do a little update of the book, especially because I kept writing the column, not through the whole 10 years, but in October of 2020, a few months, several months into the pandemic, I just had this idea of people kept, what I found is that people kept writing to me. They kept sending me Dear Sugar letters, even though I wasn't writing the column. And I thought, what better time than in the midst of a pandemic to restart the column. So I opened, an account on Substack and made the announcement, I'm bringing Dear Sugar back. And so I've been doing it every month since then on my Substack newsletter. On the last day of every month, I write a Dear Sugar column. I'm now the most recent one that was published, it was number 31. So, every month I do another column. And so when I did approach my publisher about this idea of a 10th anniversary edition that would come out around the time of the TV show, I said, let me write, a preface, let me add some more columns. I wanted to add like a ton more, but they were like, okay, we have to keep it under a certain number of pages. There was some printing situation that demanded that. But so I picked a half a dozen of the columns that I'd written for my Substack newsletter and included them in this new edition. And that came out last fall. And it's been wonderful to kind of breathe new life into this old book, because of course, I mean, this is the thing I love about books and podcasts. It doesn't really matter when you read it or when you listen to it, as long as, it's always new to you if it's the first time you have it in your hands or you have it in your ears. So, I love that a lot of people have come to the book through this new edition.
My favorite way to work with tiny, beautiful things is I downloaded on my Kindle the 10th anniversary edition, and it keeps me company in the middle of the night when a bout of insomnia or just feeling that inspiration and being awake in the middle of the night. It's the best thing to read without disturbing my husband. It really brings a lot of peace to people, and it is timeless. And it brings us into the conversation of the art of advice giving. Was this something that was always quite intuitive for you?
Well, first I want to say I love thinking that you're listening to the book, because of course I read the audio version, and it's weird to me that like my voice must be so familiar to you, huh?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
I
And I've
mean,
listened to so many of your podcasts, of course.
yeah, no, on the podcast too, I've had the experience over and over again. Like I'll just be somewhere, in the grocery store. I've had people walk from the other aisle and say, I could hear you talking. And I was like, I know that voice, you're Cheryl. So it's funny about that. But so you're, and now I forgot your question. Oh, the art of giving advice. Was I always somebody who gave advice? It's interesting because I wouldn't say so. Like when I was asked to write the column, so I was asked by my friend Steve Almond. At the time, he was just an acquaintance of mine. Now he's a dear friend. But I was asked by Steve to take over his writing of the column. And, he was just doing it kind of intermittently. And he and I knew each other's work, and we had met at a conference, but we didn't know each other well. But it was through my work that he thought, okay, wait a minute, Cheryl could write this column. I don't want to do it anymore. Cheryl could do it. So he emailed me and said, do you want to take over this advice column on the Rumpus? It doesn't pay anything. It's anonymous, and there was really nothing to recommend it. He's like, it doesn't really have a following. I mean, and it was so funny. I laugh in retrospect because, it really, there was no good reason to do it except the one really good reason, which is that I felt something inside of me that said yes. And of course, as Dear Sugar, I'm always encouraging people to listen to that inner voice. When something shouts yes, do it. Right. And so it shouted yes to me. And even though I thought, wait a minute, I'm not qualified to give advice. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a therapist. I hadn't even taken a class in psychology. I hadn't even been through therapy. And so who am I, to give advice? And what I realized is that what I was most interested in doing in the column and in my life, frankly, and certainly in my writing, is to dig into the layers of what it means to be human, to really interrogate those questions, those deep questions about who we are and why we do what we do, and how we lose and how we love and how we triumph and how we suffer and how we feel jealousy and how we heal, like all of that stuff, how we find our wisdom. Those are all the questions that I have been the most interested in my life and in my career. And so a long way of answering your question is, in some ways, yes. I think at core, I have always been, if not an advice giver, a truth seeker. And I think that is the core of giving advice, of good advice, where it's not, let me tell you what you should do, but let's look deeply at the truest answers.
I love how you always relate back to your personal life because your life credibility is your PhD in psychology. And I think that's so important for a lot of people to hear because we live in an American culture where you need the title to go out and really just share the truth or like the true medicine on our hearts. And I wonder for you, because it started off completely anonymous, did that help you become more confident in sharing the highest truth that you saw at that moment?
It didn't really. And I understand why people might assume that it did because right, you think, okay, when I'm anonymous, I'm totally free to say whatever I want to say, and there will be no consequences. And I knew from the beginning that my anonymity was an experiment. It was a temporary state of being. I wanted to see what it felt like. Well, first of all, I just did it because that's what Steve was doing. He was anonymous. But then I was like, on a deeper level, it's kind of fun, kind of interesting. But I wrote every word of the column as if my name were at the top of it because I knew that someday it would be. I knew that it didn't feel right to me to say, okay, I'm anonymous and you'll never know who I am. And you're right. I mean, one of the things that there are so many layers of things that I found to be quite interesting about the meeting of those two things that you just mentioned, anonymity and deep storytelling about my own life. Because what was interesting is a couple of I revealed my identity um about 2 years after, almost to the day, 2 years after I started writing the column. And by then I had told so many stories about my life. I had talked about my past. I had told stories about my mother's death. I had told stories about my father's abuse and abandonment. I had told stories about my grandfather sexually abusing me. I had told stories about being a mother and my two children. I had told stories about my path as a writer. I told so many stories, about my first marriage and my divorce, like honestly. And what was so funny to me is when I revealed my identity on Valentine's Day, 2012, the whole thing was like, well, who is Sugar? Who is Sugar? And I'm like, people, you know me. You know me. The only thing you don't know about me really is my name. And yet, so then we say, okay, I'm anonymous. But think about all the people, their names and you know absolutely nothing about them. And this was the more interesting experiment to me when it came to anonymity, was the ways in which story, like the way we use story to console each other, to comfort each other, to heal each other. The whole point of my using my life to give advice or to help illuminate people's questions, if you will, um, it wasn't, oh my gosh, look at me because I've had a more interest in life than anyone. I don't believe that at all. What I was trying to say is we find great consolation, great healing, great illumination, great wisdom in our ability to tell truthfully the stories about ourselves, the painful ones, the beautiful ones, the ones in which we did all the right things and the ones that we did all the wrong things. Those are all the kinds of stories I tell in the Dear Sugar column. And they're in so many of the columns, not every single one, but most of them, like you said, have a story from my life. And so I was really trying to lean into actually revelation rather than anonymity.
And there's so much God in that. There's so much connection to a higher power. And when we're talking truth, it's the holiest conversation that there really is. And I wept with you along the way. And
Mm,
I think you're one of the greatest authors that really can pull the soul of the reader to feel exactly how you're feeling. And that's also truly one of your greatest gifts.
thank
In
you.
Of course, in writing all of your incredible books, was it also a healing journey for you?
Yeah. And I love that question because it's one that reflects my own growth and evolution. My first book, Torch, was published in 2006, in February 2006. And it's a novel. So it's fiction and it's more fictional than people think because it does have, there are some plot lines that are very much from my life. It's a novel about a family in northern Minnesota who live in a rural environment, very much like the rural environment where I grew up. And the mother dies young of cancer, pretty much exactly like my own mother died of cancer. but what was interesting is so I took that autobiographical situation and then created fictional characters who were legitimately fictional, and wrote a novel essentially that spans about a year of a family's, this family during the time of great loss and grief. And I remember at the time, my first novel, my first time like going on book tour and really talking to press about my writing. And this question was asked a lot. Was it cathartic? Was it healing? Was it, and I really felt the need to say, no, I'm an artist. My intentions are artistic. And the reason that I had to say that is because, so often, especially women writers, whenever we write about emotional things, whenever we write about anything that might be interpreted as autobiographical, we're kind of, our sort of work as like serious writers is diminished, right? It's like, oh, she was just healing. It was just a cathartic journey, which is kind of akin to like, she published her journals. And so I felt almost like defensive about it. And I would say, catharsis is over here and art is over here and I am an artist, right? And then I grew older. I grew more confident in myself as a writer and the very serious work I was doing. And by the time I finished Wild, I started to feel really comfortable in saying, you know what, it's both. And those things are not, opposite. I don't think there is an artist out there of any form, a dancer, a sculptor, a painter, a musician, a writer, a filmmaker, a photographer, and on and on and on, all the kinds of artists there are. I don't think there is an artist who gives their whole essence and spirit to something the same way that I have given my essence and spirit to all my work, who doesn't feel healed by it, who doesn't go through some kind of cathartic process, an awakening, a realization, a transformation. I think art making is one of the most healing things we could possibly do. And so, yeah, those things sit side by side. And it's interesting, for years, Erin, as Sugar, I'd be like, I've never been through therapy. And it's still true. Like I've done a lot of therapy the last few years with like my kids and different, family situations. But what I realized, and this isn't to say I'll never go through an official therapeutic process individually with a therapist. I might do that at some point. But writing to me is very therapeutic because it in some ways replicates that process, that, I'm always trying to go to that layer beneath. And then the layer beneath, I'm always asking those questions. Well, why did I think that? Or why did I feel that? Or why did I think people don't understand too, like in fiction, it's the same thing. It might not be me, but this character I've created, I have to understand their psychology in order for them to seem real to you on the page. And so it ends up being incredibly therapeutic.
That's very Freudian, the what lies beneath the surface, making the unconscious conscious and diving layers and layers deeper through writing.
Mm-hmm.
Wild was a huge motivator, inspiration in my life. It's what inspired my own journey to book one-way tickets and live in Israel and India and across Asia and Europe.
Woohoo!
Woohoo, I know, right?
I'm so thrilled. That's my favorite thing, when people say that Wild inspired them to do something. That's so cool.
And now that I submitted it on a couple of days ago to my publisher, the final manuscript. And as I wrote the book, which is stories and then practical advice, next steps, if you will, Eastern ritual and Western psychology, I would tell these stories and I would think to myself, I can't believe that happened to me. I can't believe that happened, right? Maybe this happened a decade ago, but I can't believe this happened to a younger version of self. Did you have moments like that where you were baffled that this was even your storyline?
Oh, for sure. And still, I mean, I'm working on, there's been this essay I've been kind of working on off and on for literally like 10 years now. And I was thinking this morning about finishing it. And the thing I was thinking about is, people are not going to believe that this is true. And I'm like, literally like thinking like, okay, well, they can verify it this way and that way. Because yes, I mean, the beautiful thing about life, and memoirists say this to each other all the time, that like, truth is stranger than fiction. There are things that really happen in real life that you're like, sometimes things are wild or magical or, strange coincidences, or how could that possibly have happened? But it did, and that's always the challenge, it's like to be like, no, it really did. It really did. This was, this was the moment that I happened to be there for. And so much of, I think all of our lives are full of that kind of magic. It's just that when you're writing about it, it's somehow heightened and it feels like unreal.
And I just want to add, I'm so deeply sorry for the passing of your mother. I feel like that's so top of mind just from watching the show and being so invested in your storyline, especially in Wild and in Tiny Beautiful Things and all your other great work.
Thank you.
I love the chapter, and I'm sure you hear this all the time, where you ate her ashes. I get it's so primal and honest. I did the same thing with my dog's ashes, which maybe I shouldn't say out loud, but it's like you just want them. You love somebody so much, you want them inside you.
Yeah. And I think the most interesting thing to me is that you saying maybe I shouldn't say that out loud. Because it's like that tells its own story, right? And when I wrote that line in Wild, I remember writing that line because the thing I thought as soon as I wrote the line and I literally like jumped up from my computer as if it had like electrocuted me. And my thought was, I can't say that. I can't keep that line in the book. And that is really because it's true. It's really true. And it's a little bit taboo. And we're not, what that tells me, that you just said that, and that I thought that when I wrote that line, is that we're not really allowed to tell the truth about loss and grief in our culture, the real truth. And so, of course, whenever I write a line like that, where I feel like, oh, I have gone a little too far, I always think, okay, I'll take that out before it's published. And then I come down from that tree and think, no, those are the lines we need to leave in. That's what we come to art for, is the lines that are actually the truest thing. And so, keep telling those truths, Erin. Keep saying the story that the sentence that you say, I shouldn't have probably said that, right? Because that's what we're here for. That's what we're here to do. And it almost always brings good things to our lives when we do. So many people have written to me about that sentence because they've said, I did that too. I thought I was the only one. And interestingly, we're not talking about the show, but, without going too far into it, like, a couple of us really wanted that in the show. And that was a very big, point of contention, because most people didn't want that in the show, that swallowing of the ashes, because it was, quote, too much. And it is what I love about art is sometimes it is too much. It's the things that are too much that rattle us. And I think that we get to always make choices, right? Or do we want to push things a little further, or do we want to stay over here on the safe side? And I, for one, have always wanted to go a bit further.
This is one of the most topical conversations that I keep having within my community, and it's that we don't know what to do with rage. We don't know what to do with grief. I've learned that one of the most taxing things you can do to a woman who is experiencing a heightened emotional state is to hand her a piece of Kleenex. Right? It's that time to really explode, allow the fullest expression of self. When it comes to an unediting, or for people who are listening and they really want to tap into like their fullest expression of self, what would you share? What is some steps they can take?
Well, I think that, practicing vulnerability daily is a wonderful way of like learning, like it allows us to constantly engage with the truth of our emotions. And, when we do get really enraged or have that kind of like breakdown experience, it's often because we've been like holding it back, unexpressed emotion, desire, sorrow, anger, sense of betrayal, whatever, all of that mix of emotions that sometimes contributes to those big breaking open points. I think that the best way to really like be emotionally healthy is to engage daily with like that sense of like, what am I holding back? What am I allowing myself not to feel? What sentence am I saying I shouldn't have said that, or I shouldn't say this. It's really helpful to say it, even if you just say it to yourself. For years I kept a journal, and what a wonderful practice that was. What a wonderful way to just say onto the page, like even to say onto the page, what your truth and reality is so healing, and so like it contributes so much to our mental health, because it's not all just in here, right? And the other thing I would say is, to not be afraid of emotion, other people's or our own. It's okay. Like you said, I understand that gesture of handing somebody a Kleenex when they're crying. That's a gesture of compassion and kindness and consideration. But it also is saying, okay, like literally put a tamp in this now. Like, instead of saying, let's just, like, it's okay. What do people say when they start to cry? If I started to cry right now with you, my instinct would be to say, oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You go, oh no, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay. That we apologize for certain emotions, and, we're allowed to feel some emotions freely and others not freely at all. And of course, those emotions that we instinctually say apologize for because we feel ashamed, we feel like we should have a sort of composure that is actually, ridiculous. Because so what I was just going to say is, like, I think that as often as possible, not only, take up space with your own emotions, allowing yourself to cry without apology, but also granting it, being comfortable with other people's emotions. For a long time, when it comes to the ways that we've treated people who are mourning, the idea was, don't mention it because you'll upset the person. Like you just said to me, I'm so sorry you lost your mom. My mom died a long time ago. And it was very kind of you to say that, to bring her life into this space. I'm really touched by that. And I also think it's brave, because a lot of times people want, they want to avoid bringing up the dead person, because, like, oh, you'll upset the person who's grieving that person. And in fact, by not bringing them up, what you do is you just simply silence and block off that emotion. You unconsciously communicate that there shouldn't be emotion, right? And so, I think reversing the ways that we even talk to people who have lost someone would do so much to contribute to our emotional wellness. I've given you a long meandering answer, but I hope it addressed like different tentacles. I mean, you asked such a great big question. I'm just answering you all over the map.
I really appreciate you saying that. And I feel so connected to you and your story. And I even shared, and I know we're not talking so much about the show, but I was very early in my pregnancy, and I had the strong emotions that are in the show. And of course, reading Tiny Beautiful Things and Wild, I think it's a big part of why I feel connected to you, or why I understand you, or why I hear you. And I think I'm so close with my mom, and I thank God every day for that relationship. And I can really feel it through your lens. So of course, and the great rabbis say there's two times when somebody dies: the actual day they expire in this physical realm, and then the day that people stop talking about them. So we have to keep the memory alive, and you have to say the thing that's in the room, right? I've known of you for so long, for 15 plus years. And of course it has to be, your mother has to be in the room.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's like, right. If you know my work, like it's just like, my mother is everywhere in it, isn't she? And it's really interesting, Erin, because in those years, right after she died, when I was in my deep grief, there was, in my rage, in my sorrow and rage, I remember very specifically, I went one time, like for like 1 or 2 sessions with a counselor, because everyone was like, oh, go see a therapist. And I was just like, fuck therapists, because and what I said is, like, they can't give me what I want, because, like, the reason I'm sad is my mom is dead. Like, I want my mom back. Like, I didn't want the second best thing. And which was basically a way to figure out how to accept that I would never have her back. I didn't want that thing, because wanting that thing was accepting that I would never get the first thing, right? I know none of this is logical, but it's like my emotional reality. And so much of what I learned, I would say the most important thing I learned on my hike, the hike that I wrote about in Wild on the Pacific Crest Trail, was that that not only could I accept my mother's death, that here I was walking all this distance, carrying this enormous burden and not doing everything perfectly, but I was doing it. And I realized I could carry her, and that I would carry her, that my loss wasn't something that was going to be like, I'm really sad now, and then there will be a day where I won't be sad and it'll be okay that she's dead. That wasn't the journey. The journey was, my grief will change over time, and it will always be with me, and it will feel different on different days, and the burden will be lighter on some days and heavier on others. But that, like, the task was that I did have to, accept the second best thing, is that I would carry my mother with me. Well, what happened is, when I accepted that, when I realized, okay, here was this mother I would carry for all of my life, then it's like, what do I do with her? What do I do with the love she gave me? What do I do with the beauty that she was? What do I do with the love I have for her? And the answer to that, I didn't totally know the answer to that by the time I finished my hike, but I started to get an idea. But, the answer to that was that I carry her with my life, that I put her into the most important and powerful and meaningful and beautiful things in my life, my writing and the love I have for my children. And there she is in so many of my sentences. And what's so cool to me, I mean, I think the coolest thing ever in my writing is that people read my books and feel like they know my mom. People from all over the world have walked up to me and said my mother's name, Bobby, to me. And I just think, how could this even be? So I didn't get her back, and I never will. But in some ways, I got her back through my writing, because I shared her story with the world. And that has been absolutely powerful medicine indeed. And then, of course, with my kids, the way I love them is the way she loved me. And there's something extremely nurturing and beautiful about that as well.
I'm so happy to firsthand witness and hear all of your wisdom. Do you
Thank
think
you.
do you think you would ever do it again, the hike?
Oh, I would, with my niece. Yes. I love to hike still. I love to hike still. I know yeah, I mean, absolutely. I've always intended to, hike what I really wanted when my kids were younger is I hoped that we would hike it all together as a family, and then just like time turned on, and here we are. But my kids now, my son's about to graduate high school literally
Wow.
tomorrow, and my
Congratulations.
daughter's finishing her junior year. So I mean, just life gets full and hard, but maybe there will be this sweet spot sometime in the near future where the four of us could go hike it together before my husband and I get too aged. Though there are lots of really old people who hike the trail too. So I'll be one of those fit 77-year-olds out there on the Pacific Crest Trail, I hope.
Amazing. I think that's incredible. And maybe there's another book there as well.
Yes.
Cheryl, what's it like being like you're so well known and successful and inspiring and paving the path for all of us. And now you're also in this very elite Hollywood scene. What is that? What's that like?
Gosh, it's such a big question. It's thrilling and astonishing. One thing I'm often asked for advice, writing advice, career advice, like how did you get here, here, and here, and here? And, what's always impossible to answer about that question is I think that people think that there's, some like secret, like door through which you must pass to get, to this place. And what I can tell you, and I've said this over and over again in my advice is sugar, is that what I really did in a very deep way is honor the calling within me to be a writer. And I really did take a lot of risks. Completely was absolutely financially, well, just to put it this way, flat broke, really, until Wild was published in my early 40s. I really kept throwing myself in the direction always of my writing. And it wasn't about trying to meet the right people. It was trying to get the right sentences on the page or the screen. It was really apprenticing myself to the craft in a very deep way. And that is the thing that led me then, I guess, to this place. There wasn't some sort of magic thing that happened that, like, Reese Witherspoon picked up Wild and decided to option it for a film. She decided to option it for a film because she read the book and she felt it in her heart the way you did, and she said, I want to tell this story on the screen. And I think that to me has been, I would say, the most encouraging, thing about this whole trajectory I've been on, is really so much, like, pretty much everything good that's happened has happened. It began with the work. It began with me alone in a room writing. When I said yes to the Dear Sugar column, I didn't know that it would grow any followers. I didn't know anyone would read it. I didn't know it would become a book. I wasn't paid to do it even. I did it because I felt called to do it. I felt like it was a cool format in which I could explore another sort of avenue of writing. And then it led to this place. And so I always try to return to that, like, I think of the success in Hollywood and getting to go to the Oscars and the Golden Globes, like all that, super, super fun. Oprah, like all of that stuff. But that's all like out here. But where, I always return is in here. And I'm still that same person day by day who sits in front of my computer and says, I can't do this. I can't think of the way to begin to tell this story, or the way to end this story, or the way to, put all these pieces together. I'm still a very kind of humble and scared and anxious and vulnerable writer, day by day. But it's keeping faith with that. It's keeping faith with the idea that I'm wrong, that I can't do it, that has brought me to this place, I would say.
Holding everything that you're saying, and I'm sure there's some, especially when it comes to children, there's some storylines that maybe, like, I sometimes feel like as a writer that I can't write about all the things because I'm still in it a little bit, or because it's too personal for other people in my life. Is that a theme for you?
It used to not be.
Yeah.
But now it is. I mean, to some degree it was. Don't get me wrong. Like, my joke is, the most unfortunate thing about writing memoir is that other people exist. Because it's impossible to not write about other people, right? And yet it feels sometimes wrong to do. I don't like to hurt people's feelings. I don't like to violate people's privacy. And so it's sometimes challenging. But up until pretty recently, I did have quite a lot of free, not entirely, but, like, for example, I could write whatever I wanted to write about my mom because she's dead. And, a lot of people are like, well, I can't say everything about my mom because her feelings will be hurt. I was estranged from my dad. He's dead now too. But, I didn't have, like, parents I had to really protect. My siblings, I did not write about them very much because I do want to protect their privacy. So I was a little inhibited there. But then, of course, I have 2 teenagers now, and there are big stories. Obviously they're like really big people in my life, and I haven't written a lot about them, or a lot, at least in very much detail, about my mothering life and mothering teenagers. And it's for that exact reason. It's just like, well, I don't want to invade their privacy. It feels really, like a little bit off limits, which is hard for me as a writer who is somebody who's very transparent and vulnerable about my life. So, my solution for now is, like, I'm avoiding that. I'm just writing about other times of my life when I do personal writing. And then, of course, I do sometimes when I write about my kids, I ask their permission. I ask them what they think. But yeah, I think that my advice for people about that is, it's not always the right time. Like if your mother's still alive and you have a big story to tell her about it, a big story to tell her about her, it's not terrible to wait until she passes, like, and when you feel like you're freer. Now, other times you can say, you can discuss the content with the person and they'll be okay with it. Like there are all these different decisions you can make about when to write about other people.
I needed to hear that. Yeah, that's amazing. What are your writing rituals?
I lately I've sort of gotten away from rituals and I'm just and I don't know that I ever really had rituals per se. I really tend to be a pretty practical um person when it comes to my writing practice, which is get to work. And
Sit down and
I
write.
think I really had to adopt that kind of approach, long ago, back in my 20s when I was waiting tables and on my days off or, during the day before I went and worked my waitressing shift, like is when I would work. And then I had little kids and it was like when they're napping is when I had to work. And then now that I have a really busy life, it's like, okay, these are the 3 hours I have. I've got to get to work. And to attach that practice of writing to a ritual to me didn't serve me. It felt a little something like put on. Whereas if I can just say like, this is my work, this is what I need to do today and just get to it. I find that works better for me.
Cheryl, thank you so much. Assuming that this episode goes viral and everyone around the world hears it, which I really think it's going to be shared many times. What is some advice you would want to share, general advice you would want to share with listeners?
General advice. Well, I one thing that I return to so often as sugar in my advice, I feel like this is really kind of a core truth, is that, you know, trust your instincts, trust that voice within you. And it's okay to want what you want. It's okay to do what you want to do, to say what you want to say, to feel how you feel. And you don't need permission to do or say or feel or think those things. That, cultivating in a daily way, um, essentially listening to the practice of listening to yourself, trusting yourself, believing yourself, honoring yourself is in the end going to contribute so much to your well-being. There's so many of us who are afraid to give ourselves permission to be who we most truly are and to do what we most truly want to do. And I see that over and over again in all these different forms, and it's really harmful.
So there's your permission slip, everyone. Cheryl Strayed told you to believe in yourself, to go for it. How can everybody find you?
You can find me at CherylStrayed.com and also on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. I'm just Cheryl Strayed. And I, of course, have my Substack newsletter. There's a free newsletter that goes out intermittently. And then you could subscribe to the Dear Sugar letter if you want. Both of those are on Substack. The Dear Sugar letter goes out once a month, but you can find links to all that on my website at CherylStrayed.com.
And I will add all of that into the show notes. Cheryl, I'm so inspired by you. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your wisdom on Talk Show with Erin.
Thank you, Erin. It was just really a delight to be here talking to you.